Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to go back to the Supreme Court. Joining us now is former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, who is now head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which was involved in 2 election-related cases before that court. Good morning to you. I'm sure there are a lot of things to talk about in regard to what you don't agree with the court on, but you did have 2 victories here, sir. The state of Alabama will now have to redraw its congressional map to include a second majority black district as a result of this 5-4 ruling that the state discriminated against black voters. What's the political and legal impact of this ruling?
Well, first of all, I think it's an affirmation by the court that there's still a need for a vibrant Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. What the Republican legislature did in Alabama was clearly inconsistent with precedent, inconsistent with the way in which the Voting Rights Act had been interpreted. Alabama has about 27% of its inhabitants who are African American, and yet if you look at the math, they only got about 7% or 14% of the congressional seats. That decision will have an impact beyond the state of Alabama. If you look at Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, they also have instances where the lines have been drawn in such a way to dilute the voting power of African Americans, and again, inconsistent with the Voting Rights Act. And so I think that you will also see courts rule, consistent with the Supreme Court's ruling, that those lines will have to be redrawn in those states as well.
In Moore versus Harper, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to reject the theory that state legislatures can decide the rules for federal elections. I know Democrats had feared Republicans might use that to overturn results in 2024, like the former president attempted to in 2020. Does this ruling from the court, does the fact they took on the case at all, make you more confident about the integrity of the upcoming 2024 election?
Yeah, it makes me a lot more confident that we're going to have a fair election come 2024, and that this ridiculous notion, this independent state legislature theory, will hopefully just go away. That was as fringe a theory as has ever been heard by the United States Supreme Court. The only disappointment I have in that decision is that it was not a 9-0 decision. The notion of the independent state legislature theory was that courts, that the legislatures had the final say without any involvement of court review. And that's inconsistent with our notion of checks and balances. It will mean that we will have the ability to go before state courts to look at what legislatures, and sometimes gerrymandered legislatures, are doing with regard to redistricting. And just as in any other case, have courts have the final say. That's the way our system is designed, and that is what the court affirmed through the North Carolina case.
The Supreme Court did warn state courts, federal courts could still overrule on cases involving federal elections. Does that concern you?
No, not at all. I mean, I think you want to have that backstop so that if a state court does something that is, egregiously wrong, you want to have the United States Supreme Court have the ability to come in and correct that wrong.
I want to ask you about affirmative action. In this decision that race cannot be used in college admissions, there was also, written by the Chief Justice's opinion, some detail here that seems a little confusing, frankly, because it says nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. In other words, the student must be treated on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. So you can discuss race in a college application, but it can't be. How do you understand this?
I don't really understand it. It seems to me that that exception or that caveat is a little inconsistent with the rest of the opinion. And the other footnote that says, well, this doesn't apply to the military academies, which are in essence nothing more than colleges. I mean, colleges with a specialized mission. Again, it seems to be inconsistent with the holding. The thing is that, this nation continues to grapple with issues of race. And to say that race is not a negative factor for too many people in this nation is inconsistent with just what the facts are. The notion of affirmative action is to take into account just one of many things of when you look at qualified people, qualified students who are applying to colleges, look at that one of many things and say, well, you know, for the sake of diversity, we're going to take into consideration the fact that we want to have this Black kid be a part of our university. But there's not a tension between the use of affirmative action and excellence. I think people need to understand that. Affirmative action doesn't mean you get into a school simply because you're Black. It means that you're qualified, and that one of the factors that's taken into consideration of a qualified student is that person's race.
But one of the complications here in terms of the cases brought was the argument being made that affirmative action at Harvard, an elite institution in particular, was hurting Asian Americans. J. Caspian King, a writer for The New Yorker, writes, affirmative action, it was righteous in concept, but hard to defend in practice. And I want to quote, if a society should make decisions with a clear eye towards history, a sentiment I agree with, shouldn't it also follow that a group who is expelled from the U.S. would at least have the right to not be lumped in with the people who kicked them out? He's referring there to historic mistreatment by white people of Asian Americans, Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, you know, first off, you're looking at the Asian American community as a monolith, and there are a whole variety of groups that make up the Asian American population in the nation. And, you know, what the proponents of this lawsuit did was to try to pit one minority group against another so that they could ultimately reach their goal. They've been trying to attack affirmative action since the Bakke decision back in 1978. You know, this notion that somehow, some way, I guess if you think that everybody who has 1,600 on their board scores, everybody who has a 4.0 ought to be admitted to a particular school. The reality is, if you just use that as a determinant, there are going to be way too many kids trying to get into these elite schools, and you're still going to have to make determinations based on other factors. And it seems to me that making race one of those factors, just one of those factors, again, with regard to qualified students, is wholly consistent with our Constitution.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you to put on your Attorney General hat again. Would you counsel President Biden or the next president, whoever that is, to consider a pardon of the 45th president of the United States, either before or after a theoretical conviction?
I think I'd tell the president, the next attorney general, you know, to let the system do its work, try the cases, see what the results are, and then treat that convicted president or anybody else who is convicted as any other person would be treated. Pardons generally are for people who express remorse and then who have done things that shows that they have turned their lives around. If those kinds of determinations can be made with regard to the former president or anybody else who was convicted, yeah, I would support that. In the absence of something like that, I don't think that would be a wise thing to do.
Mr. Eric Holder, former Attorney General, thank you for your time. We'll be right back. Prior to last week's Supreme Court ruling, there were 9 states with bans on affirmative action in college admissions. California was the first to ban it, following a ballot initiative in 1996. Joining us now is the president of the University of California System, Dr. Michael Drake. Welcome back to the program. We want to tap into your experience here. The school system has spent $500 million since 2004 to try to drive diversity. Is it possible to have a diverse student body without affirmative action? And how do you define diverse at this point?
Well, thank you very much. You know, we've had efforts since the 90s and before to try to do everything we could to, through outreach and other methods, contact those students who we wanted to see applying to our universities. We use a comprehensive admissions process to look at all the factors that led to this person's life and their interest in being educated with us, and we think that can be done very effectively. Affirmative action was one tool that we and others used in the past. We've read the court's decision, and we had the laws in California that changed in the 1990s, and we are very pleased at our ability to be able to attract students from a wide variety of backgrounds over these many years.
Does this court ruling affect you at all?
Well, we'll have to see how it plays out in fact. You know, when we had the law change in California in the 1990s, it affected us quite profoundly in a couple of ways. In one way, it limited the way that we were admitting students, But another way, it told students that California and that the University of California were not interested in them. This was something that came from action from our regents before it passed in law. So students that we would love to have admitted, students who are fully qualified, felt unwelcome, and we found went to other schools, to private schools in California and others across the country. This is the entire nation, so it's not, students aren't hearing that we're not interested or that colleges aren't interested in them. And I think that, so it will have less of an effect on us, we think, because it affects the whole country.
Well, you've used other metrics or tools to recruit. There's a piece I just read about the socioeconomic disadvantage scale, the SED, that the that UC Davis and the medical school uses. What's an adversity score, and how does that work?
Essentially what they're doing, what Davis is doing, we applaud this, and our other universities, other campuses in our university do in a variety of ways, is look at the life circumstances of those who are applying to come to us and weigh those in a comprehensive fashion when they look at the quality of the application and make a decision. And actually we do this for every student. We look at who you are, what you've done, what makes you a qualified applicant as we're recruiting and admitting you to our colleges and universities.
So how do you define diversity? We looked at the undergraduate makeup before affirmative action and then this past fall. And the percentages, which we can put up on screen for different groups there, have shifted. The state's demographics have also shifted. The one thing that stands out is the percentage of African American students held fairly stable at this 4 or 4.5% level. Why was that unmoved, really?
Yeah, I think that the issues of racism and lack of opportunity that we find in our society are persistent and ubiquitous, and we've been fighting against those. We've been working to create opportunity, fighting against those for all of these years. Affirmative action was one tool that we used in the past. That was removed. We still are fighting the legacy of the centuries of oppression and denial that this country has applied, and doing our best to try to create more opportunity for students who come from this unequal society.
But how do you, because you're being asked essentially to quantify in some way a diverse student body, do you try to match the demographics of this state? I mean, how do you know if you're succeeding or if you're failing?
Yeah, we don't do anything prospectively. You know, what we do is try to create opportunity in a comprehensive way to really evaluate the quality of every application. We can look retrospectively and see how the students that we are admitted look like the students that are graduating from California high schools, and we certainly notice if there's a great disparity there, and we work on closing those gaps by doing more outreach to high schools that haven't been sending us students, more support programs to students to make sure that they will apply to us, a number of financial aid programs that help students from low income backgrounds, a variety of things that are meant to open up the access to the university that we feel is good for us and good for society.
I'm interested in which part of it you think works the best. And also, you know, the last time you were with us back in 2020, the school system was ending standardized testing in admissions. You've now had that in place for a while. Does that work? Should other schools look at it?
Yeah, what we found, I'll say two things about that. One, we eliminated the SAT in 2020. We did that just before the pandemic, but it happened to be implemented during the pandemic, so it's a little difficult to know how much that's affected things versus the pandemic. What we did see was an increase in applications from students who came from diverse backgrounds who were reluctant to apply in the past, even though we may have admitted them. So we're pleased to see an increase in applications from those people, and it's and our classes are extraordinarily strong. Today our students are doing quite well, so this has been quite a positive thing for us.
So you're keeping it in place, it sounds like.
Yes.
All right. Dr. Drake, thank you for sharing your insights and your experience. We'll be back in a moment. With the convergence of artificial intelligence and politics, it is increasingly difficult for voters to differentiate between real and fake. We asked Lindsay Gorman, a technology expert with the German Marshall Fund, to help us discern between fact and fiction in political images.
Let's play a first video of Hillary Clinton, apparently on MSNBC.
You know, people might be surprised to hear me say this, but I actually like Ron DeSantis a lot. Yeah, I know. I'd say he's just the kind of guy this country needs, and I really mean that. If Ron DeSantis got installed as president, I'd be fine with that.
So this is a classic deepfake video where someone has said some of these things and juxtaposed it with Hillary Clinton's likeness and her face and her hair to make it seem like she's now endorsing Ron DeSantis for president in 2024. Does it look realistic to you? What do you think?
That does sound like Hillary Clinton's actual voice, but I noticed that the synchronization was not there between the audio and her mouth. There wasn't a disconnect.
Absolutely. Looking at the mouth is a really good starting place to see if it is indeed matching what the audio is matching. The same thing also when we played it, her head sort of shook in a somewhat mechanical way. It felt maybe a little bit off. Same thing with her eyes, and here they're a little blurred out. And so that's, I think, one way of spotting how we can tell that this is a manipulated image. Yeah, so here's President Biden. All right, this one I'm going to ask you about.
You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-cop. You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-democracy. You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-American. Donald Trump lacked the courage to act. The brave women and men in blue all across this nation should never forget that.
So what did you think of this one?
He didn't blink,
Not at all, right?
so that suggests it's fake.
This one's actually real.
How's that?
This was actually a speech he gave to the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers. And it looks really like a deep fake. It has sort of a washed out look. He didn't move very much, just like with the other ones. And yes, he didn't blink for the whole 17-second clip. And when this actually surfaced about a year ago, there were conspiracy theories and people thinking that this had to have been a deep fake, even though it came from the DNC's own social media account and was later published by the White House itself. The reason that we can tell that this one is not a deep fake, we really need to rely on context and the source. First of all, coming out a full White House video, giving a speech, and these were remarks that were delivered virtually. We're not only at risk of seeing things that are false and thinking that they're true, but actually seeing things that are true and thinking that they're false. And that's kind of this liar's dividend, that in an information environment where we can't tell what's real and what's not.
A liar's dividend?
A liar's dividend, that the liar can kind of take the advantage because the liar can just say, well, maybe this audio that you caught of me, this image that you took of me, that's actually not true. It's just a fake. And it's hard to prove whether something is actually real, not just whether something is fake. And this is really advantageous sort of to autocrats and to those who would sow doubt and discord in our information space. So this one, I don't know if you saw this one when it came out. Does it look familiar to you at all?
This is the image that actually caused a market sell-off, right?
It is.
It's a fake picture of the Pentagon with what looks like plumes of smoke.
Exactly. So how can we tell that this is fake?
Well, for someone who hasn't been to the Pentagon, I think it would be hard. There is just something that looks slightly off about this building that I can't quite articulate.
These AI-generated images have a sort of hyper-realistic sheen to them, and this one has it a little bit, you can see with the plume. But really, I think this one needs a closer look. The building, as you pointed out, doesn't really actually look like the Pentagon. And even if you hadn't been to the Pentagon, you could see by doing a Google image search and doing Street View and comparing, is there really an angle of the Pentagon that looks like this? There isn't. Take a look. So these are obviously these photos fake photos of Trump being arrested.
For someone at home who may not be following things very closely, they might think this was reality.
Absolutely, especially from a first look. How can we tell that these are fake? What do you think?
Besides that not actually happening.
Exactly, and
right.
Context is a really important piece of this. In this photo, Trump has at least 3 legs. So extra limbs here, probably that one. There are a few extra limbs as well. But these absolutely capture the imagination and make people think, oh, was Trump actually arrested? All right, here's one for you. What's real, what's fake? How can we tell?
Okay, so that's his actual lawyer recently in New York. So I do recognize him in the context.
Yeah, that one's real from the arraignment.
What is this? Is this fake?
This is a fake. I think the maybe the biggest giveaway is the crying.
Right.
The actual.
Oh, is that what he's
context
supposed
of
to be
it.
crying?
Yeah, he's crying at his
see.
hearing. In sort of the technical signatures, this does have the sheen. Some of the gentlemen in the back, their faces are blurred.
This one, I want to say it's fake.
That one's real.
That one is real.
Yep.
You're kidding.
It's just the differences in lighting. Yep, that's a real photo there. And this, what you're going through right now, once you look at enough of these, the default position really does become just be skeptical of everything, which
That's
makes
hard.
sense because if it gets us to check and if it gets us to find a source and investigate and use these media literacy techniques. But on the other hand, it has some dangerous implications for our democracy and our society. We need to be able to trust in what we see and what we hear. It's not realistic for us to check and do a reverse Google image search on every piece of content we come across.
It makes having news standards that much more important. And these mostly circulate online.
Absolutely, and the role here of the media is so crucial in clearly labeling when something is manipulated, when something's fake, and when something's real, as well as a role, I think, of technologies that can give us these digital watermarks and show what's real.
And we'll be right back. The CDC reports that Black women are more than 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related complication. Tonight, BET's monthly news magazine, Black in America, explores the troubling rise in maternal mortality and features an interview with Vice President Kamala Harris. That's at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on BET and streaming on Paramount+. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Have a happy Independence Day. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.